Hi friends, welcome back to our channel. Thanks for being here and enjoying our stories. Let's dive into a new one.
I proposed to my girlfriend of 4 years, and she said no. And honestly, the no wasn't even the part that stayed with me. It was the way she looked at me when she said it. Like she'd already had this conversation in her head 100 times, and I was just now catching up. My name is Nate, and I've been sitting on this story for a while. Not because it destroyed me, and not because I'm still angry about it, but because it took me a long time to actually understand what happened. Not just the surface version, but the part underneath that I kept not wanting to look at. So here it is. Claire and I met through mutual friends at some backyard thing. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just a regular Saturday afternoon with too many people and not enough chairs. We ended up standing near the same cooler, started talking, and didn't really stop for about 2 weeks straight after that. She was sharp, driven, always thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation she was in. I remember thinking, this person is going somewhere, and meaning it as a compliment. She worked in finance, long hours, high pressure, the kind of job where your phone buzzes at midnight and you actually have to answer it or something real goes wrong. I was a high school history teacher, which is about as far from that world as you can get. Different rhythms, different pressures, different definitions of a hard day. But we made it work, or at least I thought we did. Looking back, I think I was doing most of the adjusting, and I didn't fully recognize that while it was happening. She'd cancel plans last minute, and I'd say it was fine, because it usually was fine, until it started happening often enough that fine became just the word I used instead of saying what I actually felt. She'd come home exhausted and distant, and I'd give her space. Tell myself that's what you do when you love someone who's building something real. And maybe that's true. But there's a difference between being supportive and just quietly disappearing into someone else's schedule, and I didn't see that line clearly enough for a long time. There were signs, and I think on some level I knew they were signs. I just kept finding reasons to file them under something else. She'd get visibly irritated when I suggested a weekend trip. Not tired irritated, but actually irritated, like I was asking her to do something unreasonable. One time I brought up taking a few days off together. Nothing elaborate, just a change of scenery, and she looked up from her laptop and said, "I don't really have the bandwidth for that right now." And I let it go. I always let it go, because I told myself she was under a lot of pressure and it would ease up eventually. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I was just a passive victim of circumstances, though. I avoided conflict like it was a second job. It was genuinely easier for me to tell myself everything was fine than to open a conversation that might not end well, and that's on me. I own that part of it. So about 8 months before everything changed, I started thinking seriously about proposing. We'd been together 4 years, living together for 2 of them, and it felt like the natural next step. Not pressure from anyone, just the logical direction of where we were headed. I bought a ring. Nothing over the top, just something simple and understated, because that was her taste, and I knew it well. I planned a quiet evening at home. No restaurant, no crowd, no setup that would feel like a performance. And thinking about that choice now, I wonder if somewhere in the back of my mind I already sensed she wouldn't want witnesses for whatever was about to happen. I made dinner, which I almost never do, and I remember my hands doing this thing where they just wouldn't stay still no matter what I was holding. I was nervous in a way I hadn't expected, not excited nervous, but more like the feeling of standing at the edge of something and genuinely not knowing what's below. When the moment came, I got down on one knee, and I'll be honest, I fumbled the words completely. I'd had this whole thing prepared, something thoughtful and specific, and it just evaporated the second I actually needed it. So I said something simple instead. I told her I loved her, that I wanted to keep building something with her, and I asked her to marry me. And she didn't smile. She didn't tear up. She just looked at me with this expression I still can't fully name, somewhere between sorry and certain, and she said, "I don't think this is a good idea right now." I stayed on one knee for probably 2 full seconds longer than I should have, which felt like significantly longer than that. Then I got up, and we just stood there in this apartment we shared, in complete silence, for what felt like a very long time. She wasn't cold about it, and that's genuinely the thing that messed with my head the most in the days after. She sat me down, and she explained herself calmly and logically, like she'd thought about this conversation already and knew exactly where she wanted it to go. She talked about her timeline, her 5-year plan, where she was in her career and where she needed to be. And then she said, "I can't afford to be distracted right now." And I nodded. I actually sat there and nodded, because in the moment it sounded like something a reasonable person would say. But later that night, lying there staring at the ceiling while she slept, I kept coming back to that word. Distracted. Not, "I'm not ready," or I need more time. But distracted, like I was something that interrupted her focus. That's not how you talk about a person you're building a future with. And I think somewhere underneath the nodding, I knew that. A few days later, I found out something through a friend. And I want to be careful here, because I was never fully certain of the details, and I'm still not. But from what I understood, Claire had been spending a significant amount of time with someone from her office, and had been for a while. I don't know exactly what that was, and I'm not going to label it something it might not have been. But the timing settled in my stomach in a way I couldn't shake loose, because when I thought back over the previous few months, the canceled plans, the increasing distance, the way she'd started leaving her phone face down on every surface, it started feeling less like she's overwhelmed at work, and more like she'd already been quietly closing doors for a while, and I just hadn't been paying close enough attention. Or maybe I had noticed, and I'd just chosen not to look at it directly, because looking at it directly would have meant having a conversation I didn't know how to start. I didn't confront her. There was no dramatic blowout, no ultimatum, no moment where everything came spilling out. I just sat with it, and the thought that kept coming back, the one I couldn't reason my way around, was that she had probably already made her decision before I ever got down on one knee. I wasn't being rejected in that moment. I was just being informed of something she'd already worked out on her own. And there's something about that, about realizing the conversation you thought you were having was actually already over, that stays with you in a way that's hard to explain. The first thing I noticed after she left wasn't the silence, which I'd expected, but her coffee mug. It was still sitting on the second shelf, handle facing left, exactly the way she always put it. And I just left it there. For weeks. I genuinely don't know why. Maybe because moving it felt like acknowledging something I wasn't ready to acknowledge yet. Or maybe I just kept walking past it and telling myself I'd deal with it later. The apartment still carried the smell of her shampoo for a few days after she was gone, and I'd walk through the kitchen in the morning and for just half a second forget that things were different now. That half a second, right before I remembered, was consistently the worst part of the day. I want to be honest about what those first weeks actually looked like, because they weren't clean or composed. I checked her social media more than I'd like to admit. Not constantly, but regularly enough that I knew exactly when she had and hadn't posted something new. She hadn't posted anything for weeks, which somehow felt worse than if she had, like she was so unbothered she didn't even need to perform being unbothered. I wrote her probably 4 or 5 long messages during that stretch, ones where I actually said what I meant, where I asked the questions I hadn't asked out loud when I had the chance. And I deleted every single one of them. Not because I was being disciplined or noble about it, but because I'd get to the end of typing and realize I didn't actually know what I was hoping she'd say back. I heard things through mutual friends, the way you always do. Nothing dramatic, just fragments. That she seemed focused, that she was traveling for work, that she looked fine. One friend mentioned she'd been seen out with someone, and then immediately added, "I don't know. I might have the wrong read on it." I appreciated that qualifier. I wasn't trying to build a case or confirm something I'd already decided. But I listened, and I filed it away in that part of your head where you keep things you're not ready to examine directly. I also want to say, I bought a new ring when I eventually proposed to Sophie. I know that detail might cross some people's minds. The old one sat in my nightstand for a while, and at some point I just quietly got rid of it, because keeping it didn't serve any purpose I could actually name. The thing that carried me through those months was work, and not in a healthy or intentional way. More like I buried myself in it, because being busy meant I didn't have to sit alone with my own thoughts for very long. I started taking on extra classes, staying late to grade papers that could have waited, volunteering for school committees I had zero real interest in. My apartment was quiet, and work was loud, and loud felt a lot safer than quiet at that point. One afternoon, though, something shifted in a way I hadn't expected. One of my students, a junior who'd been struggling all semester, the kind of kid who always looked like he was somewhere else even when he was sitting right in front of you, turned in an essay that was actually good. Not technically perfect, but genuinely real. You could feel him actually working through something on the page, forming an opinion and defending it, which was new for him. After class, he stopped by my desk on the way out and said, "I finally get why this stuff matters." And that was the whole moment. Nothing else. But I drove home thinking about it. And for the first time in months, I felt like something I'd done had actually landed somewhere meaningful. It had nothing to do with Claire, nothing to do with the ring I still hadn't gotten rid of. I was just useful somewhere, to someone, and that turned out to matter more than I expected. Slowly, and I mean genuinely slowly, not in a montage way, I started making changes. First, it was just her mug, which I finally moved to the back of a cabinet one morning without making a thing of it. Then I rearranged the living room, mostly because I was tired of the couch being in a spot that made no sense. Then, about 5 months after everything ended, I moved to a different apartment across town, smaller than the old one, actually, but entirely mine in a way the old place hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't frame it to myself as starting over. I just needed the walls to be different. That's roughly when I met Sophie, through a colleague who'd been trying to get a group of us together for dinner for months. Nothing was set up or intentional about it. We just ended up sitting next to each other and talking for most of the evening, and the conversation moved easily in a way I hadn't experienced in a while. She was warm without being performative about it, genuinely interested in what people were saying, not angling toward anything. I liked her. But walking home that night, I was also honest with myself that I wasn't in the place I probably should be to start something new, and I wasn't sure how long it would take to get there. We started seeing each other, and it was good, but there was this distance she kept running into that I wasn't fully bridging. I was present in the physical sense, but not really letting her in past a certain point, going through the shape of being in a relationship without doing the actual emotional work of it. She noticed, of course, because of course she did. One evening we were sitting on her couch after dinner, and she turned to me and just said, "You're here, but you're not really here." She wasn't upset when she said it. It came out quiet, almost careful, which somehow made it hit harder than if she'd been frustrated or raised her voice. I sat with that for a few days, and I kept coming back to the same conclusion. I was standing at another edge, and this time I could either keep doing what felt safe, or I could actually say the thing I'd been holding back. So the next time I saw her, I told her the truth. I said, "I'm not sure I know how to do this right anymore. After everything that happened, I'm trying, but I genuinely don't always know if I'm getting it right." She didn't pull back. She just nodded slowly and told me she appreciated me saying it out loud. And that was the first time in a long time that being honest in a relationship didn't feel like I was pulling a pin out of something. We didn't fix anything overnight. It was a lot of conversations and small moments of choosing to show up instead of going quiet, and her being patient when I went somewhere inside my head, and me actually making the effort to come back instead of staying there. It took real time, but it gradually started feeling less like I was performing the role of someone in a relationship and more like I was actually in one. About a year and a half after we started dating, I proposed. We were on a walk, early evening, the kind of ordinary Wednesday that doesn't have anything special about it on paper. I had the ring with me, a new one I'd picked out with her in mind, and the moment just felt right in a way I didn't need to second guess. When she said yes, what I noticed wasn't a rush of relief or some overwhelming feeling. It was more like stillness, like something that was always going to happen, finally happening. I've thought about why it felt so different from the first time. And the honest answer is that I wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything, not her and not myself. About 2 years after Sophie and I got married, I saw Claire for the first time since everything ended. It wasn't accidental. A mutual friend was having a small get-together at their place, the kind of low-key thing with maybe 15 or 20 people, and I knew going in that Claire would be there. Sophie knew too. I told her a few days before, gave her the full context, and she just said, "Okay, let's go together then." No extended conversation about it. No reassurance needed in either direction. We just made a plan and showed up. I'll be honest, in the week leading up to it, I'd been quietly bracing myself for some kind of emotional impact. Not in a dramatic way, but I think I assumed that walking into a room where Claire was would trigger something significant. Some version of dread or leftover anger, or that specific kind of sadness that surfaces when you're face to face with someone who used to know everything about you. But when I actually saw her across the room, she was standing near the window talking to someone, holding a glass of water instead of wine, which was different from how I remembered her at these kinds of things. What I actually felt was mostly just distance. Not coldness, not indifference exactly, just the feeling you get when you run into someone from a chapter of your life that's been closed long enough that it no longer feels like yours. She looked put together, which had always been her way. Even in a casual setting, she looked like she'd considered the details. But there was something in her expression, something around her eyes, that read as tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. More like the kind of tired that accumulates when you've been moving at full speed for a long time without stopping to ask yourself if it's still the direction you actually want to go. I noticed it, and then I immediately reminded myself that I might be projecting completely. I didn't know her life. I was looking at a person I used to know well and filling in gaps I had no real right to fill. Sophie and I got drinks, found some people we knew, and settled into the evening without any of the tension I'd been half expecting. It felt normal, which was its own kind of relief. At some point, Sophie went to catch up with the friend who'd invited us, and I ended up alone near the food table for a minute, which is when Claire came over. It wasn't staged, she was just moving in that direction, and we ended up standing next to each other. We said hi. She asked how I was doing, and I said good, asked the same back. She mentioned she'd been traveling a lot for work lately, that things were busy. I said that sounded familiar, and then immediately wondered whether that came out the wrong way. She smiled slightly and let it go, which I appreciated. There was a stretch of maybe half a minute where neither of us said anything, and I think we were both just silently acknowledging that this was strange without either of us wanting to be the one to name it out loud. Then Sophie came back, and I introduced them. It lasted maybe 2 minutes. Polite, brief, a little awkward in the specific way that kind of introduction always is. Sophie was warm without making a production of it. Claire was composed and gracious. Nobody said anything they'd later wish they hadn't. It was just two people handling an uncomfortable moment like adults, which is honestly all you can reasonably hope for in that situation. At some point later in the evening, I was showing a small group of people something on my phone. Our daughter had just started walking that week, and I had this video of her making her way across the kitchen floor with the most serious, concentrated expression on her face, like crossing that room was the most important mission she'd ever undertaken. I'd been showing it to basically everyone I saw because I couldn't help myself. Claire happened to be nearby, glanced over, and said she was adorable. That was it. I wasn't showing it to make a point or create a moment. It was just a video of my kid that I happened to have on my phone because I'd watched it about 40 times already that week. Driving home afterward, Sophie fell asleep in the passenger seat about 20 minutes into the drive, and I had the quiet of the highway to just sit with how the night had actually felt. And the honest answer was, not much, which genuinely surprised me, because I think part of me had been expecting the evening to unlock something, to surface some feeling I didn't know was still sitting there unresolved. But it wasn't there, or if it was small enough that I couldn't locate it. What I felt, mostly, was a quiet kind of gratitude for the car I was in, for the person asleep next to me, for the fact that the evening had been fine and was now over. Before we'd left, Claire and I had one last brief exchange near the door. We were both heading out around the same time, did the usual round of goodbyes, and then she paused for just a second and said, "I think we both made the choices that made sense at the time." I looked at her for a moment, and I said, "Yeah, I think that's right." And then we walked out in different directions, and that was the end of it. I've thought about that line a few times since, not in a way that takes up much space, just the way certain things stay with you quietly in the background. Because she wasn't wrong. We did both make choices. She chose the version of her life that made sense to her, and I eventually found mine. Not as a reaction to what happened between us, not to prove anything to anyone, just because time kept moving and I moved with it. The memory of that relationship isn't something I think I'll ever completely set down, and I don't think I need to. It's just part of the version of me that existed before I figured some things out about myself that I probably needed to figure out. Sophie asked me, just before she fell asleep in the car, if I was okay. I said yeah, and I meant it. She nodded, closed her eyes, and that was enough.
Nate, it sounds like that no was actually the reset button you didn't know you needed. It clearly took a lot of work to move from being someone who just adjusted to others to being someone who can be honest about their own feelings, and that's a huge win. Seeing Claire again and feeling mostly distance is a good sign. It shows that that chapter is truly closed, and you're exactly where you're supposed to be with Sophie and your daughter.